Hi, and welcome to another episode of The Language of Art. We're the co-founders of The Passionate Homeschooler and Pisan Academy. I'm Joel, and this is my co-host, Deanna.
Hi.
So in this episode, we're going to look at another painting, and in this show, our intention is to kind of go through famous works of art and have Deanna use her experience in art history as a teacher and as a former museum curator. I will, on the other hand, will serve the role of being the ignorant neophyte who doesn't really know a whole lot about art, and Deanna will show me the way. So what do we have to look at today, Deanna?
Today we're going to be focusing on the French Emperor Napoleon, and primarily the large-scale work by the artist Jacques Louis David, and we'll also look at some other depictions of Napoleon.
Okay, so just to start off, I'm just going to say I know a little bit about Jacques Louis David. I think I might have seen one of his paintings live. We might have seen it together at some point.
I think we've seen a couple, yeah.
Yep. But I don't know much of the history behind it. I don't know a lot of the context. I do know a little bit about Napoleon, but that's where I am to begin.
Okay, so let's get started. This is the painting, and it has a very long title, and it's usually just kind of referred to as Napoleon's Coronation, although that is not accurate. But the title of the painting is The Consecration of the Emperor Napoleon and the Coronation of Empress Josephine on December 2nd, 1804.
No, that's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. To just give you a little bit of insight on this painting, the only thing I'm going to say is this is a very large scale painting. It is over 6 meters by 9 meters.
Okay, what's that in feet and inches?
It's about 18 feet by 27 feet.
Okay,
it's a very large
big
painting. It's the size of a wall, right, in a bedroom.
Well, that would be the size of a really big wall.
Right.
Right? So it's 18 feet high.
Right.
So that's that's close to 2 basketball hoops.
Yeah. So it's very big.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what are your first impressions here? What do you think about it?
Well, big, kind of epic. The people are very small.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like my eye is drawn toward the center.
Okay.
So there's a dude holding a crown. So I feel like that's where I should be looking.
Mm-hmm.
It's very magisterial. I feel like I'm supposed to be feeling awe. The guy in the center is very brightly lit, along with the 2 other guys behind him.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like I should be looking there. I feel like the rest of the room is, especially in the back, it's a little dimmer. So I do feel like the light source is coming from the top. So it feels like this is it's sunlit.
Okay.
So that's what I'm feeling. I don't really have a strong emotion about it, however.
That's fair.
Yeah, I just I feel like this is clearly some kind of a celebration. On a personal level, I'm not really a big fan of aristocracies. So I do feel like this is it feels like a royal wedding.
Mm-hmm.
So it has that kind of gentility about it. But other than that, I don't really have a strong feeling toward it, other than it's supposed to feel celebratory.
Okay. That is definitely fair. Now, do you, so he's holding a crown. Now, because I've taught this painting over the years, and I had quite a few students say that they thought it was some sort of wedding. And they couldn't understand why she was bowing if she was getting married.
Oh.
If they were getting married. So, it's just when you first see this and you're not really familiar with the history that much, you see all these ladies in the back in matching dresses, and there's some men wearing matching, garments as well. So I could see why they would think wedding, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, but why is she kneeling? Hopefully that's not what's happening. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
I
and
do feel like it is definitely aristocratic, or it's definitely a royal something or other.
right, and you can tell that just
There's a
from
crown.
the crown, but also the cloth.
Yep.
And again, if you know anything about French monarchy, you'll notice that there's symbolism all over this place to let you know that this is a like sort of a royal, even though he's not in the monarchy. But you see the fleur de lis, and there are just symbols all over the place in this painting. So you're right, and there's also a religious part of it. You
Yeah,
see,
that cross is front and center. That's
yeah.
right smack dab in the middle of the thing.
Right. So let's unpack this a little bit. And we did in our first episode, I have some zoomed in images as well. And then I want to look at some other alternative views of Napoleon. So this particular painting commemorates the coronation of Empress Josephine, and basically Napoleon becoming emperor. Now, this is the first time we have an emperor in France since the Middle Ages. And this is post-French Revolutions, because there were several that occurred before Napoleon. And then there's some that comes after Napoleon as well. And so he crowns himself emperor. Well, he's crowned emperor, but he declares himself emperor. And this is him crowning his partner wife, Josephine, right? And so we're going to get into a little more of the scenery and when we get into some of those zooms. But I do want to point out some people that are in this painting that are pretty important. Now, Jacques Louis David was commissioned right after this happened to create this painting, and it took him quite a couple of years. And so this painting, this ceremony did occur in Notre Dame Cathedral. And David actually worked on the painting in another church near the Sorbonne on the left bank. And so he needed a huge space, again, because this is a massive painting, much too large for him to probably be able to, lay out a canvas that big, because it is on canvas, and paint in a studio. It's just a massive undertaking. And so what we have here is Napoleon is here holding the crown, and Josephine is down here. These two ladies are just kind of ladies in waiting. These ladies back here are Napoleon's sisters. Now, in the actual ceremony, they were the ones holding up her cape and the back of her gown. But in this painting, they're kind of standing by in this really sort of very prominent place. Here we have two Bonaparte relatives. This is Joseph Bonaparte, and he was actually not at the ceremony because of a disagreement with Napoleon, but they must have made up because he made it into the final draft of the painting. And this is Louis Bonaparte, who is the Constable Chancellor of Holland. I can't remember exactly what that title is. Now, up here in this very place of prominence is Napoleon's mother. And she actually wasn't at the ceremony, but she gets put in. We have our painter doing a self-portrait back here. He was at the ceremony, so he's included himself here in the back. And you're right to see this light source. It's almost like it's coming in from up here, and it's shining right here. And this is really our hot spot where we keep looking. Right, and then some people are in shadowed, and definitely there's a gallery up here. We really can't make people out who those people are up here. Some dignitaries all around.
Now, I do feel like I need a scorecard to know who's in this painting. So, but all the figures that you mentioned had some kind of prominence to Napoleon himself,
Right?
Except for David. But that would make sense if Napoleon were giving the orders as to who would appear in this painting. Are there any other figures of prominence that had no familial relation to Napoleon in this painting?
Well, we have Pope Pius VII back here. right?
Yeah.
So he would be overseen.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because in even going back to the Roman period, there was this thing where the Pope would crown the Roman emperor. And so there's this kind of schism between church and state, who has more power. And here we see Napoleon is crowning, not the Pope. So he's trying
Oh,
to exert his power.
right. Well, and that's that. The Pope is seated. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So we'll go ahead and we have some more details. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide and talk a little bit about Jacques Louis David. And here he is. He had this kind of tumor on the side of his face, and so he had this kind of puffy side of his face. And he was his father died, and he was raised by wealthy uncles who were architects, and he was meant to have been an architect and study architecture, but he wasn't that great in school. And he would just be drawing all the time, and it's noted in some of the documents that come out, the primary source documents about him, that he would be basically just drawing doodles in his notebook behind, like sitting behind the teacher. So he would be in trouble often and would just be sitting behind the teacher drawing. And he began painting, and he won the Prix de Rome, which is the top prize for the French Academy. But he actually went up for it 4 times before he won. And painting in this time period was extraordinarily political. It was, a lot of it was who you knew, and if you were on the good side, or if you had family connections. And so there was some drama in the first 4 attempts of him trying to get the prize, but he finally got the prize. And he spent 5 years in Rome just taking it all in, and he was so enamored with this classical past. Now,
As
when
one would do if one were in Rome and a painter. Yeah.
absolutely, right? And so he when he started painting, it was towards the end of what is known as the Rococo, which we haven't talked about. But if you've seen those paintings where there's pastel clouds and women in fancy dresses and people just frolicking, these kind of pastoral or fluffy settings, that's the Rococo. That is followed by what we call the neoclassical, and that is the style that Jacques Louis David painted in and really embraced. And so
So
spending time in Rome was just glorious to him.
he does look quite the handsome fellow with a kind of
Yeah,
a glint in his eye. He kind of looks like Anthony Bourdain.
he was definitely, he was raised by upper class parents. I mean, he had some wealth and notoriety and connections. So, and you can tell in this particular time period, there's really, if someone doesn't have those opportunities, they live a harder life. It usually does show. Not that they would have a portrait oftentimes, but there are drawings and things coming out of this time period that show some people of the lower classes. And there's a difference, right, in just how they look like they've lived their lives. So yes, he's had some pretty good opportunities. But if you look at this last bullet point, he knew Louis the 16th. And we know what happens to him. He loses his head. He's friends with Robespierre. And he actually, his very interesting history. I don't want to spend too much time on his biography.
Well, I guess you don't. There weren't really a lot of people that knew both Louis the 16th and Robespierre.
And then Marat, which
And
was,
yeah,
and Napoleon. I mean, he's
I mean,
making the
yeah, like
rounds
how
here.
that's very unusual,
It
given that
is.
you
And
you either don't travel in all of these circles, or if you did, then the next one over would probably kill you.
well, that's the thing. He escaped being killed a few lucky times. I mean, literally, it was just luck that he didn't lose his head in the time of the Louis XVI, right? And that it's just his history is worth studying in its own right, aside from his paintings.
And I just to flesh this out a little bit, I think it may be important here, and you can tell me if it is or not in terms of the context of the painting we're studying. But this is the time of Louis XVI to Robespierre to Marat to Napoleon, these are all symbols of transitions of power, and these are all. I mean, these figures represent those transitions in power
Right.
in an extraordinarily chaotic time. I mean, we're recording this in August of 2020, so we think we
Yeah.
have it bad here, but this is
It was
literally blood running in the streets.
absolutely.
This
And
is
it's
a
not
complete destruction of the ruling classes by angry mobs.
it is, and it isn't that it just happened one time in one small event. I mean, this is going on over and over, and there's overthrow, overthrow, overthrow. So one thing that Napoleon did for France was he gave it some stability. Whether he did it properly, whatever,
Well,
but I think
yeah,
people were just
as a
happy for stability.
as an authoritarian, dictator. Sure.
Right,
Okay.
right. Okay, but there's some financial stability, which was very important to the French people at the time, too. So, okay, so here we have our painting again in all of its glory. And so,
Oh, well, now that's interesting that we just talked about this idea of Napoleon representing stability out of this horrific chaos. And now when I look at this painting, I just see the sun kissing his forehead.
isn't that funny how that
Yeah.
works? Right? That, it's like sort of the gods are shining down, or God is shining down on him, right?
And this is a very ordered painting. I mean,
It is.
you don't sense a lot of drama or chaos. It's very ordered. If there's any drama in it, it would be in the relationships between the figures in here. But in terms of the visual elements, they're not conflicting with each other.
No, and again, well, this is a history painting, and history paintings document a time, like a snapshot in time, an event, a person, something happening. And
Now, you use the term history painting
right.
there as a, it sounds like you're coming from a place of that term meaning something, a history painting,
It
because
absolutely
because
does.
to the layman, I hear that term and I think, oh, it's a painting about history. What's the big deal? But it sounds like you mean something different.
So history paintings do mean something. If you go back a couple of hundred years, Charles Le Brun, who was the court painter under Louis the 14th, I believe, he yeah, it was Louis the 14th. He came up with the idea of the Royal Academy. And this is it's an academy, but it's basically a group of people who painters and artists will submit their work to, and if they like it or it passes certain standards, then it will be shown in a salon or a Royal Academy art show. And this is a time period where you don't have a lot of opportunities as an artist to show your work or get commissions. So this is basically putting your resume out there so you can get work, because the only way you get paid as an artist in this time period is commissions. You can't just go and peddle your art on Etsy, obviously. And so it's a very different time for artists and how they get work and how they work. Now, Charles Le Brun put forth these standards or this hierarchy of what is the best art versus what is good art, and then what is art that's okay. And so history paintings he deemed as the best art.
All right, so it sounds like the Royal Academy serves this purpose of being like some kind of a great arbiter of taste in the society, in the culture, right?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
but
And it's
but
not,
but in the
yeah.
same in the same way that like a guild or some kind of well, even a bureaucracy of some kind would be bestowing their own tastes or ordering their own tastes upon what at the time would be the buying public, which is
Right.
limited to a small number of patrons here. So, so it sounds like it's very arbitrary, really. If it's the taste of one person, or
It,
maybe.
it, it is. And what's really interesting about the Academy, and try to stay on focus on topic, but this is one of the things why the Impressionists later on, we're talking at the end of the 19th century, rebelled against it. They finally had enough. But we'll do that. We'll deal with that in another episode. We'll talk about the Impressionists.
Okay,
So,
so just to cap this idea, though, it was Charles Le Brun that established the standard that paintings with a historical theme were considered to be the greatest of the painting subjects in this hierarchy that everyone accepted.
right. And then second best would be landscapes and portraits. And then third best are still lifes. And this perception of what is good or high art versus what is art that isn't as important or good, in some regards, still exists today. Because, I mean, if you go into any major museum, you will see history painting after history painting after history painting and portraits and just a few still lifes on display. And I guarantee you that they have so many more in storage. Now, they're going to have more of all those paintings in storage, but they usually only put out a couple of still lifes here and there.
I love still lifes,
I do
by the way,
too.
personally,
I
but
absolutely love them, particularly artists like Rachel Roche, who they paint these little insects with these translucent wings, and it looks like they could just fly out of the painting. We're talking amazing artistry and skill.
that's not what we're
Incredible.
dealing with here in this
No, sorry,
painting.
we go off on these tangents. I apologize. Okay, so here we have a history painting, and you can see things that, obviously Napoleon is here, the Pope is here, and Josephine is here. We've talked about some of the other major players in the room. So let's zoom in a little bit. Oh, actually, we're going to zoom in just a second. Let's talk about where David got some inspiration for this painting. Now, in the Baroque period, which occurred in the 1600s, and this followed the Renaissance. So this is where you have Rubens painting and Caravaggio painting, and you have a lot of dynamism and movement and light and dark and very voluptuous women. And
Yeah,
so
this is quite a bit less ordered. It seems
absolutely.
that like there's more activity. It's like people are talking to each other. They're not really they're not as well, they're not
Yeah,
necessarily
this guy's
talking to each
looking
other, but they're
straight at us.
yeah,
Right.
they're interacting with things other than what appears to be the subject of the painting.
Right. And the faces are very caricature-like, but we're not going to do a Baroque episode today. I just wanted to show you that we know David drew some inspiration from this painting when he did his composition. So, oops, sorry. I'm always famous for doing that. Okay, so here we have the cardinal crowning her. And so this is the church bestowing upon, and this is Marie de Medici, and there's
Oh, okay.
this is a whole what's called the Medici cycle. And if you ever get to Paris and you go to the Louvre, you go into the Rubens room and you see this entire cycle. My sister and I spent about 2 hours in this room looking at these paintings. And again, like that David, these are massive paintings. They're not just little, 2 by 3 foot. We're talking very, very large. I don't have the exact dimensions, but on the scale, maybe not quite as big as David's, but very, very big. And they take up this massive gallery in the Louvre. And so here you can see her. She's got her hands, folded like is in prayer, like similar to what we see Josephine. She's looking up. Just keep that in mind. And then you have all the people in attendance. But here we also have some allegorical figures throwing down some gold coins for luck. Her 2 dogs are also in this painting. So he included her dogs. So this is, but again, the whole layout is, we know that David did take some inspiration from that. So now let's look at these the main focus point of both of these side by side. So here she's looking up to him, and here she's bowing down to him. That's very interesting, right?
Mhm.
And so it just shows that, you know, he is crowning. He is showing that he is more important than the church, whereas the church holds sort of dominion over everything still on this side. And she's kneeling, but Josephine has this lovely pillow. And again, earlier I'd mentioned the fleur-de-lis, which was kind of this throwback. It's a symbol of the monarchy, really, but Napoleon adopts it. And so we see the fleur-de-lis here. We see it on the robes. And then there's also the Napoleonic bee, which is a symbol of Napoleon as well throughout the painting.
What is that again? What's the
just there's a bee, and he adopted it as a symbol.
What, like the letter B or
no, the insect?
The insect. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, and so here we can see that the Pope's hand is raised, and originally it was in his lap, but Napoleon told David to change it as if he's signaling for the emperor to proceed with what he's doing. One other thing, let me just go back here. In the original painting, Napoleon was going to be crowning himself. Again, showing that he had ultimate power. But they thought that the message would be too sort of
narcissistic.
Yeah, you know, the sort of egotistical megalomaniac type of thing. So they softened it by crowning Josephine, who already has a crown on.
Oh, yes, that's very true.
Isn't that quite interesting? See, she doesn't have anything on her head.
Yeah, where's that crown gonna go?
This is a man's crown. As well.
Okay.
Typically associated, although she's got the crown here, so, but okay. So we see the Pope here, and then for Josephine, again, these, in the actual ceremony, these two women, they would have been his sisters. This is a relative. It's this, I think, Napoleon's nephew. And everybody is looking on, and you were right to point out in the fact that in the Marie de Medici series, people are kind of doing their own thing, like what you would expect in a normal ceremony. You know, some people are kind of maybe having a little sidebar conversation, or they're looking around, or, you know, something that catches their attention.
Yeah, no, everyone is, you know, they're not even looking at Josephine.
No, they're looking, all eyes are on Napoleon.
Yeah.
If you see the eye line, right? Okay, so let's look at a couple of other depictions of Napoleon to get to really know him. And so that painting was a double coronation, but it really focuses on him crowning his Josephine. Now, this is Napoleon crossing the Alps, and they're done a little bit apart. The one on the left was done by Jacques Louis David, and there are actually 5 versions of this painting. And the drapery around him and some other little details in the background, the color, like the light and dark.
He's a superhero.
Right.
On the left, right?
Yeah. So in the 5 versions, there's some variations in some of the things, but basically he looks the same in every one of them.
Does he have the red cape in all of them?
No, the colors are a little bit different. This band around the horse. Sometimes it's a darker scene around. And so this is the one that was done in 1802. The first one was done in 1800, and then they were painted subsequently up until, I think, 1808 was the last one. Oh, one other thing about the Coronation painting, there are 2 copies of that. In 1808, some entrepreneurs from America commissioned another one. And so David painted it, and then
What happened to it?
it ended up returning to France. So the original one that Napoleon commissioned, David actually hung in a studio until 1819, and then it was transferred to, it went on display in Versailles, and then it was moved to the Louvre, where it still hangs today. The second copy ended up being taken back to France and hangs in Versailles. So if you go to the Louvre and Versailles on the same trip to France, you will see it twice, the two different versions. Okay. So in this one, there are 5 versions, 2 of which are at Versailles, and then there are, I don't remember where the rest of them are, but there are 3 other ones outside of Versailles. Okay, so here we have Napoleon on this horse. Back here you can see his troops, but he is the main focus here, right? And you see this sort of determined expression on his face.
Yeah, he's a leader of men here. He is
Right.
He's rallying the troops.
Right.
By the way, I don't. Where are his troops in the one on the left?
On the one on the left, right down here on the bottom, you can see these wagon wheels. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah,
and then there's little people down here.
Okay.
Right. So he is the commander, the leader. Right.
Now I see them.
And
well,
so this really shows
they're under the hooves of his horse.
Right. And they're crossing the Alps, and this is not an easy feat in any way. And so here he is, and he led many battles against Prussia, against Portugal, and even his ally in Spain he overthrew. So he basically spent his time as leader of France on the battlefield, quite a bit of it. So quite a few years later, there was another painting by Paul de la Roche. And so this is Bonaparte crossing the Alps. So tell me, I guess I should have asked you this before I started talking about the one on the left, but just give me some sense of what you think and feel between these 2 depictions of the same sort of moment.
Well, that is okay. So, I mean, it's pretty clear. I mean,
Right.
it's a pretty obvious difference. I mean, like I said, Napoleon on the left is a superhero.
Yeah.
And he is, he's inspiring, and he is, he's a figure of immense power. Now, on the right, he's clearly defeated by the elements. I mean, his horse is sad. He's wearing brown. Like he's not happy. Like he looks cold. It looks like he's shivering.
Mm-hmm.
And his men are much more prominent, and maybe a bit more on an equal footing with him. The mountains seem to be closing in on him.
Right.
Like they're so much more prominent in the frame than he is, or at least they appear to be just overwhelming him.
Right. So what's interesting is that David was commissioned to paint these portraits.
The other giveaway is that this was painted in 1850.
Right. So in 1802, David was commissioned by the King of Spain to paint this portrait of Napoleon. And then several others ensued, which is Napoleon's like, hey, that's pretty cool. And so, he commissions them as well. And this is really sort of like this propaganda where it's not realistic. I mean, if you're crossing the Alps and it's cold and winds, and these are really foreboding mountains, this is just like a glorious, I'm having a great ride in the country on a Sunday afternoon in the sunshine kind of painting, right? And so de la Roche was not opposed to Napoleon. In fact, he really liked Napoleon, so much so that he thought that David's painting was not good because it didn't depict the real man who was heroic in his own right. You didn't have to glorify him.
Well, de la Roche felt that.
That's how
Right.
Delaroche
We're
felt.
not
Yeah.
we're
No,
not
that's not
making a
my
judgment.
opinion.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. No, this
Wanted to
is
be
what
clear about that.
Delaroche said, right? And so he wanted to depict Napoleon as he would have really looked and would have felt as he's going over these really tumultuous mountains, because Napoleon tried to surprise his enemy by taking this mountain route that was pretty difficult, which is what the element of surprise would have been. So he's not trying to be disparaging. That's just kind of what it ends up being, really, particularly to the modern eye. So Napoleon's not even riding a horse here. He's riding a mule.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, and
Which
he
is what
does,
you do in the mountains.
right, because you want to be on a mule because they're very sure-footed, etc., right? That's why they use mules in the Grand Canyon instead of horses. And so you have Napoleon here, and he does look cold, but we see that there's someone on foot guiding his mule,
Yeah, I
right?
want to ask you about that person because he's fairly prominent. I mean, he's hidden by the mule, but
Yeah.
in terms of stature, he's about as um, he's hunched over,
Mm-hmm.
so he's clearly taller than Napoleon, which
Well,
it's not hard to do.
Napoleon was known for
Famously
being,
a small man.
yes, short,
Hmm.
probably about my height, 5'2", maybe
Yeah.
a little. Yeah.
So, is there any meaning behind the person who appears to be guiding the mule?
No, other than it would have been like his attendant, or someone of lower rank because he's on foot, and Napoleon is up high on the horse. So I just wanted to kind of point out some different depictions of Napoleon, because David was the court painter, and so you do what you're told. Really, you're being commissioned to do this. Well,
Well, when you put them side by side, the one on the left is clearly propaganda,
exactly, right.
now it's interesting that you say that the one on the right is intended to be, at least the author had an intention to be more respectful by
Mhm.
being closer to the truth.
Right, because he said Napoleon was a hero in his own right. You don't have to over-glorify him.
Yeah,
Show him as he was,
and
and it
yet
doesn't come across.
no, it does not.
Yeah,
That's the point that I'm trying to make. When I see, particularly when you see them two, side by side,
right.
uh, and the artist must have known that the comparisons would be made. Especially if he's clearly pointing out the problems with
Hmm.
the prior painting. So he must have known that that would have been an issue, and yet he chose to depict this in a much more naturalistic kind of way.
Right. Now, one also thing is that by 1850, you're starting to come out of neoclassicism, and you're starting to come into Romanticism, which is something we haven't talked about yet. But whereas David was really embracing this neoclassical tradition, and so this equestrian portrait dates back to the ancient Greeks and the Romans in particular, of having great military leaders depicted on their horse.
And
And
in this sort of pose of action.
exactly, and it definitely harkens back to the Romans.
Okay.
Whereas Delaroche is in this new sort of time period of artistic movements, artistic and literary movements, where you start really feeling your smallness in the world. And it's this, a lot of the things that come across in Romanticism are this sort of man against nature, and that really is coming forth in the Delaroche as well.
Well, that is very interesting if that was his intent, because to my eyes, when I see that, I see someone who doesn't have any heroic stature whatsoever. He's just
Right.
beaten by the elements. And if the artist had intended to portray him as a hero, then something was missing, and if he is subject to the style that was in vogue at the time that he was painting, then I can understand that to a certain extent, but it doesn't have, he's not communicating a heroic value in a timeless way.
Absolutely not. No. And again, it's almost like a pendulum swing, right? On the one side, we have David, who is glorifying. And then on the other side, we have someone that rejects any glorification. And this is what results. And so maybe something in the middle is actually a little more representative.
Or something on a completely different axis altogether.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I have one more comparison for you. Oops. Okay, so ignore the picture on the far left. And we have two last portraits of Napoleon that I want to show you. And so go ahead and just kind of tell me what you think about these two.
Well, the one on the left appears to be much more kind of feminine, really, and younger, almost childlike. And it's evokes more of a regal setting. I mean, it appears to be intended to portray a royal kind of vision.
Right.
There's the chair that looks like a throne, but then there are the staff that the two staffs that he appears to be. What's the plural of staff? Stave. That he has these two staffs, which I don't know if they're if it's some kind of a spear or weapon, but
they're it's more sort of ornamental. They're not weapons.
Yeah. So I mean, it's really it looks to me that it has more of an intent to communicate his aspirations toward his emperor status.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. Now, the one on the right seems to invoke more of his stature as a military leader. So, yeah, of the two, the one on the right. I mean, the one on the right seems to be more of the vision of Napoleon that I think of when I think of him.
And what is that? Describe that.
Well, first of all, there's the visually, there's the hand tucked into his shirt. That's always the vision that I think of when I think of Napoleon. So on a visual level, but I think I've always, I mean, in my head, I think of him as more of a military commander than an emperor. The emperor business seemed to be more of his aspirations to be like a Julius Caesar or an Alexander or something, or actually more Julius Caesar than Alexander. But yeah, and the one on the right seems to be a little more commanding too, and the other one, the one on the left, for me, seems that he's someone play acting at being an emperor, like he's cosplaying.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so the one on the left is by the artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ang, and this was done. Napoleon is in his coronation robes, and so it is a very official portrait. And he is meant to look kind of like Zeus, or we know that Ang also borrowed from the picture on the left from Jan van Eyck, who we talked about in our first episode. This is from the Ghent altarpiece, which is his masterpiece that him and his brother did together. And so here we have this panel, and so we kind of see this same sort of pose being taken. So we believe that was kind of borrowed as well. And so those are some influences. We also know that Ong really idolized Raphael. And so if you know Raphael, there's always this sort of, he was a Renaissance painter, but we always have this pyramidal element where there's like this pyramid, and here we see the inverted pyramid with the two staffs coming down.
Oh, okay.
So that's kind of hearkening to Raphael. Now, this particular painting was purchased by some Italians, and some interpretations is that he was here meant to be shown as sort of the ruler of Italy and not of France, although that has also been disputed. But critics were not favorable to this portrait when it came out. They thought that there was this weird thing with color, that there are some Carolingian symbolism, which the Carolingian dynasty was in the Middle Ages, and they didn't think that that was very appropriate. They really just thought it was very archaic, and they did not like it, this particular portrait. They did not like the depiction, but if you look at it, there's this, the way that he's depicted, not necessarily the collar that he has on, but the look on his face and the sort of laurel wreath crown, it's very representative. Also, I always have thought of Julius Caesar in the way some of his, just that stern look on his face.
Okay, so I can see why you would say that if you were focusing on the face by itself, apart from everything else, but everything else feels to me that he's just a pretender to this role.
And that's, so, I mean,
and I don't know if I'm just projecting that from what I know about Napoleon, but that's what I see. I mean, he just looks like a young boy, and his face is very pale. So it feels like someone who's too young to appreciate the gravity of the situation and is just playing at it.
He does look very youthful in this, right? And so this other one, now if we look at some of the imagery around him, there are papers rolled up on the desk. There's the sword kind of leaned up against the chair. And this is really hearkening to him, like what you think about him as a military commander. So not trying to like have this whole pomp and circumstance, like I am the emperor and God chose me, which is kind of the feeling that we get from the portrait by Ong, but that, hey, I am a doer and I am a man of action, is what this other little bit later portrait by David is trying to emulate.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because it's it doesn't have, I mean, is there more to this painting? I mean,
no.
Okay, so is that the frame itself?
That is the frame. Okay. Yeah, that is the whole painting.
Okay, because if that is the frame, that's it's a very interesting composition. I mean, okay, so for starters, it's much more human.
Right.
His face actually looks like he has good circulation, or that he gets outside in the sunshine a little bit. But it's definitely much more of an intimate portrait than the one on the left.
Right. And it's almost like you startled him and he turned around.
Yeah.
Right? Like, oh, wait, hey, hi, I'm working. What are you doing? And there are also rolls on the floor. I don't know if you can see them back there. Back here, there are some book stacks. Yeah. So this is a workspace. This is where I do my strategic thinking when I'm commanding the troops.
Right. Exactly.
So, and here you can see the Napoleonic bees on the upholstery. Just point those out. And again, this is his study at the Tuileries, which is right by the Louvre, which was a palace. It was a palace, and then up until 1700 something, that it became a museum. But there were still offices and places all around there that were occupied by the royals and then ultimately by other state officials who came in. So that is our tour of Napoleon. Let me go back to that coronation. And so way that you that I recommend people teach this is definitely in context and looking at Napoleon. Now, I wanted to do this particular sort of series about Napoleon because we have a unit in our high school curriculum on Pride and Prejudice, and Jane Austen, in all of her novels, she includes soldiers, and so in this time period in the Napoleonic Wars, definitely, the military and what was happening, and Britain had an amazing navy, but they also had over 200,000 legions on, within their troops. And so military was omnipresent in this particular time period. And a lot of it points to Napoleon because he was
the enemy.
He was the enemy, and he, would overtake Prussia, and then he had an alliance with Spain, and he even turned his back on them and, conquered the Spanish king that was his ally. And so he had these grandiose plans. He was emperor and wanted to rule Europe as it had been many centuries prior. And so when teaching this sort of art, particularly these history paintings, including the history, including some primary documents, we have documents written by David himself. There are letters, and there are contracts that exist. There are also documents by people that knew Napoleon. And so when you read those documents and then you look at these paintings, because art, particularly paintings like this, these are also primary sources. And
Well,
so
you can also get the impression from this that, if you know that the artist David was directed to compose his painting,
right,
the manner that his subject wanted, it changes your sense of what's going on here. I mean, I don't think you can really understand the meaning of this unless you know what Napoleon's character was like. If you have a sense of him as a grandiose, dictator, authoritarian, narcissist, that in that light, you can really tell what's going on here. And
right.
I didn't really put those two together until we had that little chat about the chaos that preceded Napoleon,
Right.
and coming to this work with just having discussed that, and it's interesting because you asked me what I thought about it, and I didn't really have much of a reaction to it, because even though I did know a little bit about what happened in the French Revolution and how horrific it was in terms of humanity, human cost.
Right.
And if you think about that, and then you think about a population that was just starving for order, and let an authoritarian dictator assume command,
Right.
then this painting makes more sense.
Absolutely. And if you come to a painting like this, if you're visiting a museum and you just come upon a painting like this, you can read the wall text, maybe a paragraph or two. Sometimes they have an audio guide and you can listen about it. But unless you really have that background and understanding of the time period and what all of this means, and Napoleon, David painted propaganda paintings, right? That's what these are. He puts his mother there and she wasn't there. And, they kind of rework the way things were. And this is in Notre Dame Cathedral again. And they shrink the cathedral down to make the event seem, much more intimate, and where the people seem much more present in the space. Whereas if you were really to depict Notre Dame, you probably wouldn't see those arches towards the top of the painting because it is just grand. And so he's kind of shrunk the space, included some people, did some rearranging, did some spectacular things with the lighting. And this is what you get. And so we call it a history painting. But the history paintings also are,
It's not really
it's not like reading
an objective history, right?
Right.
It's
And
a
so
little bit skewed to fit the subject's
it is, and that's
desires.
why It definitely is skewed, and that's why it's so fun to study these things and these paintings and then know the history and pull out the documents and try to understand what is going on so you can read the painting like you would a book.
Yeah, and even more so because if you know that if you have a sense of the context and you know what the artist is trying to do, and if you know that it's propaganda, then you can start to unpack it and not take it as gospel,
Right.
much like you should do when you read any kind of history.
Exactly. And for Pisan Academy, we like to call like anything we're doing with history. So we have a Shakespeare unit, and I call it triangulating. So we're triangulating what Shakespeare said against the sources he would have used to write the fiction, and then figuring out who Julius Caesar really was, right? And you can do that also with Napoleon here by looking at these different depictions of him. And then you pull in some documents or some readings about Napoleon based on primary sources, and voila, you've got a great history lesson.
I think Napoleon would have greatly loved to have invented a time machine that he could bring Shakespeare into his time so that he could have a play written about him.
Yes, I'm sure he would have loved that.
All right.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, that's I have to say that I did come to this a little bit, Napoleon as a subject of history does leave me a little cold because he's not one of my favorite, dictators in history. But
if one was to have a favorite dictator, it would not be Napoleon.
Right. But understanding the context and particularly of the time that he emerged from makes a lot of this propaganda piece much more interesting to unfold. So that is a lesson. And that brings us to the end of another episode of The Language of Art. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Yep.